Vouchsafe, over to you.
Thank you. Hi, I'm Lisa.
And I'm Nandita, and we're here to introduce Vouchsafe, the world's most forward-thinking identity verification platform.
Vouchsafe is the key to unlocking access to vital services to everyone who needs them.
Here's the problem. There are 11 million people in the UK that don't have a passport or driving licence, and because of this struggle to pass a traditional identity check. That figure is 1 billion globally. This means that many people, and primarily the most vulnerable, struggle to access vital services like bank accounts, benefits, and employment. Many more are at risk of entering this precarious position. The majority of adults in the UK are financially undisturbed or fragile, and this is only going to get worse with the deepening cost of living crisis.
This is also a huge problem in the financial sector, with 20% of adults struggling to pass a traditional ID check. That's effectively 1 in 5 potential customers who are being turned away.
We've done extensive research to understand the spectrum of needs and barriers that users face in accessing a passport or a driving licence. To start with, it's far more expensive than it looks. It's a clear example of the poverty premium. To get a passport, it's £108, including postage. Extra and hidden costs, such as paying for supporting documents like birth certificates, rack up the already really expensive process. Secondly, to get a traditional ID, you often need to know someone in a special profession. The problem is, this really doesn't reflect the society that we're living in. Many people don't have a solicitor, and barely anyone knows their GP anymore. Plus, even if you do, they often get you to charge to vouch for you. You also need to have prerequisite documents like a birth certificate. This is another hurdle for many who can't afford or access them, which is common, for example, with survivors of domestic abuse. It's clear then that there are major barriers in accessing a passport or driving licence. FCA guidance addresses this by placing an obligation on financial services to accommodate for customers who lack a traditional ID. Some banks are already using alternative means to pass KYC checks for the hardest case user, such as accepting a benefits letter, which the customer has to present in person. Now, the problem is these processes, they're convoluted, they're irregular, and they're really hard to navigate. And to make things even harder, like we spoke about, bank branches are closing at a rapid rate.
The solution to tackle identity verification is to use something that everyone in society has and is integral to who we are, our trusted relationships.
Vouchsafe is the only tool that allows users to prove who they are by having someone they trust to vouch for them, as well as traditional methods. You don't need to rely on having expensive, old-fashioned paper documents. Vouchsafe is becoming the front door to lots of government services. We're actually currently working with our first customer, the Scottish Government, to enable everyone to access the services they need. Vouchsafe really isn't a new idea. Lots of systems and services use vouching to prove certain things about their users. A common example, which many of you have gone through, is when you have to get a new job, you have to provide a reference to your employer. Another example is when you put in a DWP access to work claim, you have to nominate a colleague that vouches for the hours that you worked that you're claiming for. Sorry, that came up dark, but I'm just going to say anyway, we're bringing vouching from the fringes of identity verification to the mainstream through a standardized and automated process. Here's how we do it.
There are 3 main things happening in a vouch: the user journey, the referee journey, and everything we do in the background to verify the identity being claimed. The user takes a video selfie from which we do a liveness check. They share some basic information and can also upload supporting evidence like NHS, HMRC, or benefit letters. The user then nominates a referee, who can't be a close relative, partner, or someone they live with, but it can be anyone else who knows them. And then the referee does their bit. They review a photograph of the user and answer some basic questions about the person they are vouching for. Then they do a video selfie and take a picture of their passport or driving license. We assess the information provided and check the biometric information to ensure the voucher is valid. And while the voucher is the centerpiece, it's by no means the whole process. We carry out a whole range of background checks using a wider set of data sources compared to traditional checks. We go through this rigorous process to understand the fraud risk, establish an activity history, and gather independent proof of the user's identity. Vouchsafe has been designed with data protection as a core principle. We don't store any personal identifiable information after the user's identity has been verified. We hand the proven identity back to the customer, but never any biometric data. We only store audit trail data to support fraud investigations. We encrypt all data when it... Oh, sorry. We encrypt all data and when it's being moved from one location to another and when it's being stored. Our process is compliant, it's secure, and it's fast.
Vouching is a game changer. We're already making strides in access to public services. Now we're offering the same opportunities to the financial sector. With Vouchsafe, firms can onboard 25% more users while continuing to protect against fraud risk to the same standard, making services more accessible and profitable.
Our ROI calculations show what firms could stand to benefit from onboarding customers who normally fail traditional ID checks.
We'll have all the relevant regulatory approvals completed over the next 6 months. We're already in the process of getting certified to the UK Digital Identity and Attributes Trust Framework, which, to quote from the policy, is part of the government's wider plan to make it easier for people to verify themselves using modern technology, with the aim to create a process as trusted as using passports or bank statements. We're driven by our user-centered approach. We've done about 50 research sessions over the past 6 months to gain in-depth insights and accommodate for diverse user needs. We're then driven by the goal to create meaningful change. We're tackling the root causes of inaccessibility to services, not just finding a quick fix, which really doesn't solve the problem. But we can't achieve this alone. We want to work, that's the time. We want to work with regulators and firms to really understand how to integrate vouching into KYC processes to create a process that is secure and accessible and can tackle financial exclusion in the UK. Thank you. Yep.
Right, what a powerful presentation, and the gong was a bit unfair since you interrupted.
That's okay, minor tech, but we work with it.
All right, questions?
Great, really great presentation. How digital ID is obviously a really big issue for financial inclusion and lots of other sectors. How are you dealing with getting through those regulations? So the risks, as a regulator, I'm always concerned about the risks, and how are you minimizing the ability for people to defraud or get access to the vouch that they shouldn't get?
Sure. So firstly, I think my colleague's going to answer the risk aspect of it, but I'm just going to touch upon the regulation. We've actually done a lot of work with policymakers in the UK and in Scotland to work through this very exciting document called the GPG 45, which basically regulates identity verification in the UK. So there's been a massive effort and push to kind of modernize how this policy works, because vouching is present in it, but it's not used for identity verification. So we're kind of working with policymakers to ensure that what we hit is the medium confidence level of an identity risk, which you can then used to access nearly all government services. So we're just proposing, I say medium, but actually that's an extremely high level of risk strategy. But Lisa will talk about the fraud.
Yeah, and we're using something that's already established, so it's a vouch, but we're using it in a way that we want it to be something that can prove your identity legitimately, like a passport or a driving license. So we do that in a number of different ways. The traditional vouchers you sign, so somebody signed for a passport, that's it, that's done. With our process, the referee takes a picture of their passport or driving license. So they're staking their own document on the vouch. And there's also a limit to the number of people that the referee can vouch for. But as well as the vouch being the main thing, there's loads of other checks that go on in the background. So politically exposed checks, third-party checks, bereavement checks, watch list sanctions. There's so many checks that happen, and we also want to use government databases as well. It's like HMRC. So those married become a really quite robust system.
Yeah, so a really important set of problems to try and solve. When you talk about verifying identity, do you see that as a binary thing, or do you see it as a spectrum where you're verifying identity for different purposes and different checks are required for different types of access and product?
Yeah, so that's interesting. I mean, our core obviously work is in identity verification, and that's the work that we've been doing with the Scottish Government, because our whole purpose is access to services that are vital for people who need them. And we are specifically targeting the most vulnerable. That being said, this has been a really interesting process because we're widening it to other sectors. Based on that, currently, yes, it is identity verification, but we're really interested in seeing what other checks we could integrate into that. Kind of what you were talking about, once you have the person at that moment of contact, how can we add as much value as possible to get the best thing for the customer at that time? So yeah, there's definitely additional checks that are like aligned to identity verification that we'd want to do at that point.
And could I ask one more, which is, what's your commercial model?
So we are B2B. So currently, yeah, our sector is very broad. So we're working with the Scottish Government, but we're also really interested in like working with credit unions, working with charities, working with any kind of organisation that work with vulnerable users and they're struggling to onboard them because of failures in identity verification. But that also obviously extends to the financial sector because, like we've spoken about, there's so many people who struggle to access them. So currently it's a B2B model, but the user itself would not have to pay to kind of get their identity verified.
Also, if I've got just to add on, what you were mentioning before about with the community and make it things like citizens' advice and universal credit and all the social kind of where people go to first, right? That's where I kind of see it. It is quite a versatile product, but that's where it would be good for me. Like last year I was unemployed on universal credit, and this is a lot of these products that are like, oh, I wish you could just walk into, you know, and they would have all this information and lay it out and be like, you know, take your pick. Yeah. So it can be used widely, I think.
On that note, we're also really interested in having these different like journeys of like digitally assisted, because I think like the audience member was talking about, we are focusing on the people who need it the most. And so we don't want to exacerbate the structural inequalities that already exist in society. So I did this research session with my grandma and she was like, no one goes to the post office. Like, why would you go to the post office? They don't have any time. Go to the library. That's where they have people who are there, who have time, who are able to assist you with that journey. And even though that's specific, it might not apply to, say, a rural situation, I think our purpose is to work with community, it's to co-design together to understand those intricacies of it.
All right, we are at time, but thank you, Vouchsafe.